Welcome to Podcast Awesome, where we chat about icons, design, tech, business, and nerdery with members of the Fun Awesome team.
Fun Awesome, go make something awesome. Fun Awesome, go make something awesome.
I'm your host, Matt Johnson, and we've heard from a few of you that you'd like to get some pointers on how to start a podcast. And while I'm definitely not an expert, I took this podcast project on last year and we released about 20 episodes. So I'm definitely a newbie at this, but today I'll give you a behind-the-scenes look at what it took to get Podcast Awesome off the ground. And I'll share the lessons that I learned along the way and point out some of the pitfalls that I wish I had avoided. I'll talk to some bona fide podcast professionals, including Chris Enns, who masters the audio of our podcasts, and my old pal, Matt Carter, who's semi-famous in certain corners of the podcasting, interwebs, and rock and roll landscape. So here's the deal. We had this wish list of cool stuff we'd wanted to do for years buried in an old Basecamp thread, and one of those items included some initial brainstorming about a podcast. I've never produced a podcast, and I didn't really know what I was doing. I'm definitely a fan of about half a dozen podcasts myself, but as far as producing and editing, I was totally clueless. I had a ton to learn, but I did get the impression that I'd get the support I needed, so I just went for it. Initially, I added more ideas to the Basecamp brainstorm I found for the podcast and sent it along to the bosses for consideration. But, it sort of went into a black hole of the other nice-to-have projects. Honestly, I never heard back, but I wasn't offended. Fun Awesome's a pretty busy place, so I opted to just start recording episodes and just see how it went. Besides, I figured if the podcast sucked, it was better to ask for forgiveness later than to sit on my hands waiting for the green light from the boss. So to help tell the story of the making of Podcast Awesome, I thought it'd be fun to turn the tables a bit and ask someone to interview me for a change. So I enlisted our fearless icon designer, Jory Raphael, to ask me some questions about what I've been learning along the way. So take it away, Jory.
We thought it'd be fun to talk about why we decided to do a podcast and then get a little bit into the nitty-gritty of how we make this particular podcast for anyone who might be interested in starting their own or laughing at us because we're doing it wrong.
I'm sure there are a lot of folks laughing. Yeah, it's funny to even attempt this because I feel like I'm completely building a plane in the air. So
yeah,
we figure it out as we go. And my hope is that folks that are fiddling around with the idea of podcasting and they're maybe feeling a little bit overwhelmed or intimidated to say, I'm like basically a Luddite. If I can do it, anybody can do it. So that's the big idea.
If Matt can do it, you can do it.
That's right. This was really a wish list type thing on a number of things that wouldn't it be cool someday if we did X? And there was some kind of throw some paint on the wall planning buried somewhere in a Basecamp or a Notion document or something like that. Travis and someone else who was interning at the time had put some ideas together, and I came along when I was contracting before I was full-time. They said, hey, we'd love to get to this project eventually. And I thought, that might be fun. I've never done that before, but maybe we should check it out. So it kept coming up in conversation every so often. So I filled out the rest of that content plan and put some ideas together. I'd mentioned this in other podcasts before too, not throwing anyone under the bus here, but I would send off ideas, like, hey, this could be a season 1. What do you guys think? And silence, crickets.
Well, to be fair, later. Because as someone, as the person on the other side of that, or one of the people who would get those notifications, I was just sitting there waiting for Travis to respond. So I figured he wanted to. So it wasn't.
That's pretty much all That's what we're all doing, is waiting for Travis to respond, really. Like,
yeah.
Travis, could I please?
Well, you could joke that, not throwing anyone under the bus, that you're not getting the response. Like, unless somebody grabs the metaphorical bull by the metaphorical horns and just like takes ownership over it, it's not gonna pop the stack.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you did that, right? You jumped on the bull.
I jumped on the bull, man. I grabbed those horns and just rode it off into the sunset. So I thought, oh gosh, I'm not hearing back, but I know this is definitely still a wish list item. I know for sure that they want to do this. So I'm just going to start playing around and see what happens. I knew that initial goal of sort of humanizing the team and introducing folks to our team was really important. So that was one way to sort of break into that first season, even though I didn't fully have a content plan super fleshed out. That was a little bit low hanging fruit, because I had been putting out some blogs called our Nerd Show and Tell. And that was sort of the idea, is to say, we want to introduce you to developer Mike and what he's been working on, the challenges that he faced in the last split. And by the way, he likes to do this kind of stuff outside of work. So I just took that idea from the blog and started doing conversations with folks to sort of spin out that Nerd Show and Tell with the team. And it went really well. So, and then we sort of filled in every other episode with other business related or culture related stuff, a little bit of icon related stuff and design stuff. So it's been really fun.
And if memory serves too, some of those earlier conversations for the blog we jump on calls together. And you'd kind of, mock interview or ask questions and kind of flesh the story out, but also would record some things just so you wouldn't have to solely rely on your memory for writing some of that stuff up. We're already recording these things. We're already having conversations. What if that's what we put out into the world instead of regurgitating it into a blog post or something like that?
Yeah, it's been a good exercise on that for sure. Yeah, and you just, you get a couple decent mics, figure out a little bit of the gear stuff. Like you said, I didn't change the workflow much as far as gathering information. It's, maybe a little bit more planning, but not much. So hopefully that can be encouraging to folks that are interviewing, say, subject matter experts and creating content or whatever. There's not a whole lot of extra stuff you need to do to actually produce something. So first things first, capturing the podcast awesome vibe and subject matter was crucial. We settled on theming our content around icons, design, tech, business, and nerdery because, that's what we put out into the world. And as for the style and format of the podcast, I opted to loosely plan the conversations and try to capture an informal conversational feel. Kind of like how the tone and voice of our fun, awesome blogs and marketing materials come across. Kind of curious, funny, knowledgeable, and playfully nerdy. I just had a hunch that if I could capture that feel of what conversations sound and feel like when we work together in person, then it'd be mission accomplished. So far, I think it's going pretty well, and I owe that all to my interesting and knowledgeable conversation partners on the team, and of course, my winning personality. The stuff we've put out on the Font Awesome blog and on the website has kind of a vibe of, how should I say it, like a celebratory nerdery. Yeah, we're nerds about a good many things like tech and design, but it goes way beyond that. If you've spent any time with developers and designers, then they're really into the stuff that they're into, and it tends to be pretty dorky. At Font Awesome, things are no different, and we're all about what Dave Gandy calls sharing our nerd. The nerdery could include all the usual stuff like video games, movies, collectible toys, and all that kind of stuff. But it goes way beyond that. It's that compulsion that we have to dive deep down into a rabbit hole to learn as much as we can about a given subject, to find the best, most accurate information, and to have fun while we're doing it. Anyway, the point of this tangent about company culture is to highlight the importance of communicating from the core of what your company values are and what your brand stands for. I'm lucky in this regard because Font Awesome is full of personality and the voice and tone of our brand is pretty front and center. But not all businesses have that kind of vibe, so you may have to go digging under the surface to get clear on that. Here's Jory again asking me about the discovery process of nailing down the Font Awesome vibe for the podcast.
Matt, you mentioned earlier that one of the things we wanted to do with this was get the voice of the company out and give folks an insight into who we are. Are there any things you lean into to help with the podcast vibe and the subject matter we choose to talk about?
Yeah, that was pretty simple, honestly, because I think Font Awesome leads with a pretty strong brand identity. It's kind of hard to be objective about that. But I guess I would say even before I was on full time, just sort of perusing the blog and the website, I got a sense for this is the personality of this brand, which is going to be super fun to work with. So the brand identity seemed pretty front and center, which I think really helped to shape what we're going to be about and the tone that we wanted to set. I think probably other companies where that brand identity isn't as front and center, you have to do probably a little bit more digging to get at that. You're going to get right in the middle of talking about conversations of culture when you're talking about brand identity. But I think a lot of the times people, they make the mistake of saying, well, culture is just all the fun stuff that you do at your company. But that's not exactly what that means. It's what does your company stand for? What are your values? What kind of good are you trying to put in the world? Those are the kind of things that you ask when you're talking about culture. The advantage with Font Awesome is that kind of geekery, nerdery, and fun is just sort of built into what the culture is about, a sort of lightheartedness. And so that made it a little bit easier to just be a little bit off the cuff and let our nerdy interests show through, because it's very front and center to what we do. Our copy often is kind of playful on the blog. We're putting Easter eggs on the site, so you're always within a stone's throw away from like dorky movie references and pop culture stuff, which is super fun. If folks have listened to conversations, say with Dave about sharing your nerd and all that the things that we do outside of work that excite us, that kind of animate us, that may not have anything directly related to the work that we do, but sharing that part of our interests with each other at work, it creates an environment. You're kind of loose. It helps to build trust and you can just get more done. And it's just baked into the culture. So especially when it comes to conversations specifically about culture, say with the podcast, it's easy to just slip right into that because it's just part of what we're doing all the time,
Yeah.
It was pretty easy. What are we about? We're about icons. We're about tech and design. And we knew that we wanted to talk a little bit about business culture stuff. So identifying that wasn't super hard. Once I knew that highlighting the nerdery at Font Awesome was important to the feel of the podcast, it was as equally important to capture that tone naturally. And it was easier than I thought because I've got good rapport with my conversation partners and I genuinely enjoy everyone on the team. So more often than not, conversations, they feel relaxed and natural. Speaking of which, now may be a good time to introduce you to a podcasting buddy of mine, Matt Carter, who I've learned a ton from. Matt's in a band called Emery, and he and I run in some of the same social circles. Matt's been podcasting weekly in one form or another for the better part of a decade. Currently, he hosts a podcast called Songs and Stories, and he's hosted many others, including Break It Down, Bad Christian, and the Labeled podcasts. Once I knew I was going to get Podcast Awesome off the ground, I was going to have to pick his brain on how to make this thing happen. Initially, I had in mind to ask him about gear and tech, like how I'd record the podcast with my guests often being remote, what software I would need, microphones, stuff like that. But true to Matt's conversational style, he went on a rant about something completely different, and I'm definitely glad that he did. The original conversation that I had with you, probably a year and a half ago, I reached out and said, hey, I got some questions about podcasting. And what I remember is you talking about how important it was to set the stage for the person that you're talking to and make them feel comfortable so it feels authentic. If you set the stage and you make it comfortable, it's sort of like you bring somebody into your living room, you're like, hey, can I get you some tea? So they don't feel on the spot. Tell me a little bit about that.
People want to obsess about the gear.
Right.
And so it's not bad to do that because you need to have a fluid understanding of equipment and technicalities, but it is so just something that you need to get a grip on so that it can become background.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't, just like a carpenter could build something with somebody else's tools. It's like you could drive a different carpenter's truck that day, use his tools. You have a background on how to use the tools and knowing what's going to be good or not. So music's the same way, recording and podcasting. And if you're if that's new to you, then yeah, it takes that part of your brain that is active, because it's like learning to drive or something like that. But really your goal should be to get it to be as background as possible and second nature as possible, so that you can reach into the higher levels of connection and communication.
Everything that you're saying about the gear makes total sense. Like that needs to be in the background. You need to have a little bit of knowledge of that. And that's what I've learned too. And going back to the technology part, if I mess up, there's a lot of stuff that I can do to fix it. Maybe in years past, it was harder to do that. But the most important thing now is I'm really trying to figure out how to keep that engagement really good and learn how to listen to people. So I might come in with a plan, but it might go in a totally different direction. So that means I have to be a really good listener. And as a host, like you invite somebody into your home, you want them to feel comfortable and at ease so that you can let it see where it goes,
Yeah, into your home is the way to think about it. Like you don't run out of having dinner parties because you're out of ideas of what you're going to talk about at a dinner party. You just think it's nice to have your people you already know and trust or like or want to get to know.
Yeah.
That you feel good enough about to set up an engagement. The context is everything.
Right.
And you like it. So what could go wrong unless you panic or are nervous or in your head or self-critical or worried about what you're going to say next, and then you're not listening? Like that's how everything goes wrong. And that's that's if you're listening to podcasts, you hear a guest start to open up, and then you hear the host like sabotage it with some shallow question, like out of or whatever it is to not he just opened something, but it's not in your script. So you're going to say something dumb and panic about what you're going to fill the next space with and yank to some other, so when did you, like some pre-planned question? It's like, no, missed opportunity there. And you hear it. I mean, you hear it all the time.
Oh yeah, for sure. I'm actually remembering a time when we podcasted, you were doing a podcast sort of tracking some music history stuff. And you were talking about how you were learning more about how to put a story arc together. And so you were getting different folks to come in and talk about certain time periods and a music scene and stuff like that. You were trying to build a story arc, which was a really good thing of how to put the podcast together so that it was engaging. But I remember you were asking questions that probably were prepared, as my guess. But at some point, I became more animated and you're like, oh yeah. Tell me more about that. So you knew how to hone in to where the energy was and where it was going to go, which could possibly have gone off script, but you knew how to ride the wave, Well,
but that whole thing was kind of a big failure. Like, this is a really good. It's a failure to learn from, and it's not really a failure, but this is probably a good illustration. Because it's like, well, I'm good in audio, I'm good at talking, and I know all these people, I know the story. Let me just try to put a narrative together and do a bunch of interviews and put it in the story I want it to be. Well, that was a disaster because I was going to just do that just as a research to make a film. But as soon as I get interesting people on and start talking to them to get them to say what I want them to say for the story arc, it's not even true. It falls apart for me instantly. And it's like, what is this stupid story? That's not even, how am I supposed to know what this, it just falls apart because reality is so messy. Like you said it, when the energy happens, that's what to follow. And then to put it in the story is so I'm continually frustrated by that. I just naturally gravitate toward associative, divergent, energy things that are led by curiosity. That's just what makes me feel energy and become engaged. So I don't see the point in not following it, but you never know where you're going with that. So, but that's part of the adventure of it. So it's like, how can you really create context that are broad enough in which you are free to just explore and discover and follow curiosity?
See, what did I tell you? Matt's always got really interesting things to say. He has a way of seeing things differently and really getting at what's important. So really appreciate his insight into podcasting. So the next thing on my list that seemed pretty important to get a handle on was the software. What would I use to capture and edit the audio? The good news is that there's a ton of tools out there, and some of them are even free. The bad news, though, is that there's so many options that it's easy to get an analysis paralysis. It's like when you're standing in the toothbrush aisle at the drugstore, there's just too darn many options. It can be a little hard to nail down how to get started. To get help with how to get started with podcasting, the art of editing, choosing gear and software, I wanted to check in with Chris Enns from Lemon Productions. If that name sounds familiar, it's probably because I always mention him in the closing credits of Podcast Awesome. Chris masters our audio, so each episode sounds crisp and clean. Here's Chris.
For friends or just family or whatever who are or acquaintances who are like, how do I get started? I think the biggest message I would say is don't overthink it. Mm-hmm. What you do in your first 10 episodes, you'll learn from tremendously. And by your 20th episode, you'll be doing things vastly different than what you did in the first 10. And similarly to get to episode 50 or 100 or your second show or your third show. For me, it was like I would start a show, do some stuff, learn some things, make some mistakes, start another show. And it was kind of like almost disposable in that sense. And so if you find a podcast hosting platform, like I use transistor.fm a lot. I forget which ones you guys are with, Sprout or Buzzsprout or Spoutcast.
Buzzsprout. Yes.
They're all in that space. The awesome thing about podcasting is it's very transportable, and that's the benefit of it being based on a very open standard called RSS. And you don't need to understand what RSS is in order to podcast. Yeah. It's on a much more open standard than if you're picking, where to, I don't know what the best example is, but like which social media platform, right. Pluses, minuses, where you go. You might pick something like Transistor or Buzzsprout or Simplecast. And the core thing they do is distribute your podcast out to everybody else that wants to subscribe in whatever app they want to subscribe in. Mm-hmm. That's the coolest thing about podcasting. I think that people underestimate or maybe just take for granted is how portable your podcast actually is. Try it out. And you don't even have to tell anybody about your podcast. Just try that experience of recording your voice. What I always used to tell people back earlier in the days before we kind of all understood what podcasting was is just record yourself into your phone, into your computer, whatever microphone and software you have handy, and listen to that. And make sure you actually like the sound of your voice before you start down this road into podcasting, because obviously you're going to hear your voice a lot and it can grate on you. The second step is definitely you need to edit at some point, but make sure you actually like doing that and hearing your voice before you go too far down the road. Yeah, it's funny. One of the things I advise folks on is if they're jumping into it and they're feeling a little bit anxious, I don't know if I've met anybody that likes hearing the sound of their own voice. It's like, I sound like that, is usually the reaction. And I just say, you just have to get over it. Don't overthink it, because that's how people hear you. And chances are they don't think it's annoying. It's just your voice. You're not accustomed to hearing it. So just get over it. Just keep going. Don't overthink it, Well, especially if you're editing yourself. I have the advantage or disadvantage, depending on how you look at it, of editing other people. So their vocal tics, let's say you say like a lot, or you say a lot. I edit that out so that the other person doesn't end up hearing that ever. And maybe I've gone back and forth on like, am I the Photoshop, the equivalent of like Photoshopping a model's blemishes on their skin? Am I doing that for audio where People don't ever hear the vocal tics they have or the things that they do that might annoy their friends or whatever in their voices. And anyways, you'll get to hear yourself and learn to speak better as you do it more often, which can only help you in other ways, in meetings, in public speaking, et cetera. All those things. There's plenty of other sort of benefits, side benefits that come from starting a podcast that may only last 10 episodes. You still learn a lot about yourself in the process.
What would your tips be for somebody that's just starting out that maybe isn't super familiar with recording software and how to approach editing in general?
With editing, the step before that's kind of a big one is recording. Obviously, you have to record something before you can edit it. And there's some sort of software term like garbage in, garbage out. I feel like from my comp sci classes, I remember something like that. Similarly, here with audio, we have amazing AI tools for cleaning up audio. But if you start with a really echoey, reverby, and there's a lawnmower in the background and you're sitting at Sydney Harbor with birds over top, you're not going to be able to do a lot to fix that, obviously. But assuming we're in some sort of relatively controlled environment without a bunch of noise and a bunch of echo, while you record your podcast and you record something, editing is a bit of an art, and you're almost much like when you're editing a written document. You apply a bit of your personality to it, or at least your opinions to it, in terms of what you think should be kept in the recording or published episode. And just for an example, with Podcast Awesome for Font Awesome, I'm not doing a lot of content editing, but there is a moment where maybe someone laughs for 30 seconds instead of 20. And maybe I think, okay, well, we can cut that off probably and get on to the next thing. Because as you're sitting there, listener, I'm acting as the listener, as the editor, and trying to do keep them in mind more so than I'm worried about what the podcast or guest, obviously staying true to what they're saying, but edit with the listener in mind. Much the same way that your content on your website or your Twitter account is about the reader of that. And you're not worried about whether your boss wants the logo bigger or their vanity text or whatever on there necessarily, if that's not actually or coming to your website or your podcast for. So
no, that's really good. I think that's absolutely true. When you're in the room, either in this sort of scenario online or physically with another person, there's a certain chemistry, but then it's a different experience from the listener perspective, and you're trying to serve the needs of that person. They're coming to you for information, and our job is to give them something valuable. So we could say that part in the conversation that was so hilarious for us, it's like, well, they might not be in on the joke in the same way. So you got to figure out how to finesse that and make it seem natural at the same time.
Yes. And then the technical part of editing is making sure it sounds natural too, with our delays on Skype or Zencaster or whatever. There is just delays. And so Jory tells a joke, you laugh, or obviously you just have to line that up and you chop it up. And I think that's on the technical side. I've learned to be more ruthless in terms of editing and knowing that each podcast has a different vibe. And so you want to stay true to that. And so in the case of Font Awesome, obviously a bit lighter, okay with jokes, okay with having a bit of fun with it. Even with what a corporate or business entity is telling their story, why they did a thing or why they're going to do a thing. I think people, especially in a podcast format, wanted a bit of behind the scenes. They want some personality. And so, whether I'll just throw Jory under the bus because I know him a little bit from back in the day, but if Jory's joke doesn't land very well in the episode, sometimes it's okay to leave.
Pretty common. Let's be honest.
Let's be honest. The cutting room floor here is littered with, but you might want to leave that in because it's or whatever. I'm using a bad example here, but you might leave some of those things in because it shows the personality of the host of the software company that you're actually following. At the end of the day, Font Awesome is distributing fonts. There's lots of personality in there, but there's not a lot of humanity in terms of what I am aware of as a user of Font Awesome. And so if I'm subscribing to the podcast to learn about the people behind it, I want to learn about them, not just the technical.
What would your advice be for somebody in regards to gear they ought to buy, or how should they think about gear purchases and software that they should use?
So bearing in mind that budgets vary and needs vary. So obviously we could be talking to somebody who's like you at a company X and they have budget to buy some gear, but they don't know what to buy. Or we could be talking to someone who's just like, they have $100 that they want to throw into this podcasting hobby. And what should they do with that $100? We'll try and thread that needle of both those conversations. I look at some of this gear, and I'm talking to you on this mic that I bought almost 10 years ago, I think. There's a way of looking at it similar to what musicians look at. At least I tend to. Maybe it's just justification of buying random things that too many guitars or whatever. But there's always a market for somebody to buy that thing that you're buying used. So if you've got the budget or can afford it, then buy something like a Shure MV7, for example, just to pick a slightly more expensive $300-ish mic, which is a great mic, plugs into USB or can be used as an XLR mic in a fancier mixer setup. You buy that mic and you use it for 6 months. You realize podcasting is not for me. You can resell that and you'll lose the $50 or whatever that you would have spent maybe on something like the ATR 2100 is about $100 Audio-Technica ATR 2100 USB mic that also works and is very serviceable as a microphone, comes with a little tripod. If you're going into it thinking you want to do this, and you, especially this day and age where we're all a little more familiar with what podcasting is, investing in some gear that makes it fun to use, you're also sort of putting a bit of your own skin in the game, so to speak, with your money. If you've got $100 and that's all you have to spend, then get the ATR 2100 mic. It's great. And then from there, as far as recording the actual conversations, let's just assume you were doing remote just for now, because remote recording is easier these days than in person in a lot of ways. If you were in the room with me, your voice echoes back into my mic and my voice goes into your mic, and it creates more of a mess for editing. I'd recommend using a service like Zencaster, StreamYard, Riverside, Squadcast. They all do remote recording really well. And what I would say to you is, if you're testing out the waters of recording a podcast and producing a podcast, just sign up for a month. They're all month to month as far as I'm aware. $20, $30. You'd spend that easily in other software and things like that you could use for recording. You can schedule out 2 or 3 or more recordings in a month very easily. Just do the recordings and listen back to them. Don't worry about having to edit them all before you do your next one. You have a bunch of audio and video potentially to work with that you can then mess around with in editing before you worry about whether this is a thing you're going to pay for every month. Download your recordings and throw them into something like GarageBand on the Mac, or Audacity is a free one that you can download on Windows or Mac. On the Windows side, or if you're in the Adobe system, there's Audition as part of their creative suite. I use Logic Pro, and there's a million other apps obviously you can use, but just pick one and start.
Well, thank you, Chris, for sharing your expertise from years of experience in the podcasting world. And for anyone who needs expert help on podcasting, you can reach out to Chris at Lemon Productions, and he can help you with consulting, editing, and mastering.
One of the really cool things I feel about our podcast, and that sets it apart a little bit, is that we have a pretty awesome theme song. When you were sharing some of the early podcast stuff that you were doing and some of the early interviews before we launched the official podcast, it was all great. But the moment you kind of fed it to us with the intro and the music, and everything started to feel real, and it was something like, oh, there's a there. This could be something. It was this like the magical ingredient, I feel like, that kind of, this is going to sound like a horrible thing to say, but like it was like the MSG that just made me want to come back for more. It's like, just couldn't stop at one bite.
That's right. It's cool how that came together. I knew from the outset we probably wanted something that sounded a little bit maybe Game Boyish or vintage computer game soundtrack vibes. I thought, it'd be cool if we got like an 8-bit chiptune kind of vibe. So I went on different websites, just getting samples of the vibe that I thought we'd like to go for. I sent off a few stylistic options that I thought were in the ballpark. And Dave said, one of my favorite bands from the 90s is Joy Electric. Like, it would be so cool if we could get that guy to do the composition for us. And I was like, well, Dave, I kind of know that guy. So
yeah,
in a past life, I was touring around in a rock band, and this guy, Ronnie Martin, was fronted that band Joy Electric, and very different stylistically, but we were on the same record label. If you haven't heard Joy Electric, seriously check it out. That guy is such a pioneer musically. He figured out how to record these really interesting synth sounds in a way that I think few electronic music folks were doing. And I don't totally understand the ins and outs of that, but I do know that he was building each of these sounds individually from scratch before it was easy. Now we have all this software or whatever, but he was doing all this stuff analog, and super interesting group, super poppy electronic music. So anyway, with that in mind, I was like, man, I know he's really busy. He pastors a church, so he isn't doing as much music now. But I reached out to him, and we had somewhat of a rapport. We weren't exactly friends, but we kind of ran in the same circle, so we knew who each other were. And he was totally game for it. So that was awesome. I just gave him a few rough ideas on kind of what I was going for stylistically. He gave us 2 musical ideas, and it was easy. It's like,
knocked it out of the park. And it's kind of based on, at least the general tune is based on this little button we had on the original Font Awesome 6 video, I think, which is at the very end when the logo pops up. The editors of that threw in this little bit of just him saying, Font Awesome, go make something awesome, with a little bit of, had a little bit of
Font Awesome, go make something awesome.
Yeah,
little chant.
Very simple chant. And Ronnie took that chant and put it to music, and made it so much more than it was. We use it on our screencast now, I think. Yep. Do we even use it in our screencast? We use it in the podcast, and it is just so fun. And we've been
getting great mileage out of it.
Yeah.
He did an awesome job. I'm super stoked that we got that. And we could have paid a licensing fee for something that was already out there. There's a lot of great stuff out there, by the way. If you don't have budget to get an original composition, check out sites like Pixabay, and even freesound.org has a lot of stuff that's really good. Read the licensing agreement on it. Just make sure that you understand that before you use it. But there's a lot of free stuff that's cool that you can check out. In fact, I even use some stuff from freesound.org for some of the interstitials that sort of fit the vibe. Another guy that I hired, another acquaintance of mine, we kind of run in some of the same circles. I knew this guy, Zach Malm, who had composed these chip tunes on a Game Boy, actually made music on a Game Boy. So I was like, that's a no-brainer. I'll reach out to him. And I gave him basic parameters. He knew exactly what I was going for. And so he created, I think, like 10 or 12, like 30-second little things that I knew that I wanted to use to break up the conversation in the podcast and get that into the general way that I edited. And those have been great. So,
and an example of one of those is insert noise here. And another example is insert noise here. Yep. And that's the power of editing.
That's right. Exactly.
Actually, the editing is amazing. I will just say, I love the stuff you're doing with it. And especially when I think there have been a few occasions where you've something sound more important by adding some reverb and some amplification to it, or like, I don't know, inserted a fart, or you just it's really just plus oneing, taking what we've given you and making it all the better for it.
Well, thank you. Format wise, there was another podcast that I'm a fan of that had a way of breaking up the conversation with these little musical bits throughout. And content wise, it was very different. It's not tech related at all. But I started thinking about how I wanted to put this together. And we could have taken the approach of one conversation, start to finish, that's kind of long form. But knowing some of the folks on the team and their personality, I thought some folks might feel a little bit on the spot, to where it would feel too awkward to have it super planned out. And if I ask them a question and they don't have something fully thought out or whatever. So I knew that the way that I was editing and producing each episode, if there was a sameness, which included those music interstitials, that was going to really help with the overall feel of the finished product, but also while we were editing. In fact, we're actually just doing it in real time now in our conversation now, is that because I know those music interstitials are going to show up every 5 or 6 minutes in the conversation, I'm able to set up a conversation with somebody and say, so it feels weird to have a microphone in front of you. Don't be nervous. We're just having a conversation. If I ask a question and you're not sure what to say, if you need to take a pass, if you need to restate something, whatever, don't worry about it, because I'm going to edit with these little musical bits. So it'll make sense.
Yeah.
So just say whatever comes to mind. I'll figure out how to put it together. So I knew going in that I definitely wanted to take that approach formatting wise.
And because we go on tangents all the time. And this is like a tool that helped us make sense of those, I think.
Okay, so when it comes to marketing, promotion, and content planning, I'm probably not the best source of wisdom, at least not yet. My goal for the first season of Podcast Awesome was just to get the darn thing off the ground and get some episodes out there into the wild, which I did, so mission accomplished. But you can definitely find a lot of really good marketing and content planning stuff out there on YouTube, and there's a lot of good stuff worth checking out.
Now, Matt, just as we kind of wrap things up here, looking back at this journey we've taken so far, Podcast Awesome, is there anything you change?
I think what I said earlier is not getting too caught up in the bells and whistles of different software. I think I was looking for ways to streamline my workflow, but potentially made it more complicated than it needed to be. Mm-hmm. So start with something really simple and feel like you have some general mastery over that before you add other stuff. It's just not really necessary. Another thing is when it comes to the nitty-gritty of editing, I think for a few of the episodes early on, I thought that cutting out breaks in the conversations and cutting out the ums and the ahs of conversations and things like that was super, super important. If you overdo that, it can make the conversation sound a little bit robotic. I would say definitely cut out the breaks and some of those filler words, but don't overdo it because then it just doesn't sound natural.
Yeah, there have been some times, and I think this may be my style of speaking in particular, because I find that it sometimes affects me more than others, but if maybe it's because I take a lot of breaks when I'm talking and I think through some things before I always say the next word. And so if those are broken out, it sometimes sounds like I'm just plowing through and not giving anyone else a chance to respond or talk. And I just keep talking forever and ever and ever and ever and ever and ever and ever. And it feels like a monologue when it's in reality, it wasn't.
It wasn't. It's true. It's true. That's something that I would change. It's not a big deal. It's just a learning thing that you figure out as you go. And then I would say when you're in the nitty gritty of editing, especially if you have a episode that's the editing is taking a good bit of time, send a draft to somebody else that has time to listen to it and give you honest feedback. Because there's stuff that you miss, or sometimes I'll send something to you or to Dave and you'll say, well, you can cut this part out. That's not totally necessary. Or this edit was a little bit choppy or whatever. It just helps to smooth it out. And it's good to have a second set of ears on it.
Yeah. And when we're recording, we are like, you and I have now been talking for almost an hour. And the podcast episode, when this gets released, will not be an hour. Right?
Yeah, probably 35 minutes. Yeah.
Yeah. You're going to cut out a good chunk of it. Hopefully mine it for the gold, or at least
gold solid gold, baby.
Yeah, or at least the Formica.
No, man, it's only solid gold. Only solid gold.
Only solid gold.
So there you go. There's the quick and dirty tips I have for those of you interested in starting your own podcast. And I'm definitely a newbie when it comes to this stuff, and my approach probably has a ton of holes in it. But hey, season 1 went better than I'd anticipated, and I'm excited to learn more and get better at the craft of podcasting. Okay, so here's another formatting thing you might want to consider. This is the part where we roll the credits at the end. So thanks to my generous workmates for encouraging me in this endeavor and for being great conversation partners. And thanks for giving me lots of freedom and advice along the way. This here podcast was edited and produced by yours truly, Matt Johnson. And as I mentioned before, the Podcast Awesome theme song was composed by the talented Ronnie Martin. and the music interstitials were composed by Zach Malm. The audio mastering was done by Chris Enns at Lemon Productions.